Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University. School of Education, SOE, Certificate Programs. Postgraduate Certificate in Information and Assistive Technologies for the Instructors of Visually Impaired, PGCIATIVI. MVEI 011 Understanding the Learner. Block-1 Understanding the Disability. Unit 1 Definitions, Meaning and Concept. 1.1 Introduction. This unit analyzes the concept of disability, logically classifies different types of disabilities, handicaps etc., studies general meaning as well as the specific definitions, formal, informal, thereof, and finally endeavors to create empathy towards the disabled. 1.2 Objectives. After going through this unit, you will be able to identify and define different types of disabilities, handicaps and impairments. Describe major disability issues. Explain the attitude of the society and the state towards persons with disabilities during different phases of the history. 1.2.1 Meaning of disability. The term disability is, generally speaking, a kind of absence or lack of one or more of capacities which the majority of the human beings possess and without which our physical or mental activities are restricted partially or totally. In the following paragraphs, we will study the general meaning as well as the definition of the disability. First, let us look into the general perception about the disability. 1.2.2 The general perception of disability. In our day-to-day life, we interact with several people. During these social interactions, have you observed something which attracted your attention? At times, we come across such persons who happen to have lost their limbs, or whose sensory perceptions are hampered due to no functioning of one or the other sensory organs. Daily, many people are injured due to the road accidents, terrorist attacks, physical violence of numerous kinds and many other reasons. Some of these injuries permanently restrict some parts of our body. Sometimes, some deformities are developed due to some ailment. Likewise, there may be some situations where we find that the person we are interacting with has a problem with her sensory organs. At times, you had to interact with such persons. Try to recollect, what was your reaction under such circumstances? Your interaction with such persons was normal, or did you feel some hesitation in these situations? It is a psychological fact that whenever we run into some person who looks to be different from the normal human beings, we try to make a distance with such persons. It is not that we have a problem with them or we hate them, but the reason is that we generally do not know how to interact with them, or let us put it this way, that we have not been trained to communicate with such persons, as usually we do not have to deal with them. The units of this block have been designed with a view to train the learner to communicate with the disabled in general and the visually impaired specifically, as after the successful completion of the course, the learners should be able to teach the persons with special needs. In this era of the slogans like inclusive education and the education for all, it is essential for those who wish to choose teaching as a career that they should have the ability to cater to the needs of each and every learner while imparting knowledge and skills to them. The teachers, vocational as well as the academic, should keep in mind that it is a part of their profession that they should understand the needs of the disabled learners and should be able to communicate and interact with them as easily and normally as with any other learner of the group. The general attitude towards the persons with disability has changed positively through the ages. Before the Industrial Revolution, the society hardly believed in the capabilities and the potentials of the disabled, whereas at present this perception has distorted, thanks to many favorable conditions, which would be studied under the heading The Historical Perspective. The persons whose physical, sensory or mental activities are restricted permanently due to some injury, ailment, mental, physical, or some kind of deformities developed before birth, are called the disabled persons. Thus, we find that we can divide the disability in 4 broad sections. A. Physical disability or handicap. B. Sensory disability or impairment. C. Mental disability. And D. Multiple disability. We will study each one of these disability under the section, types of disabilities, but first let us look into definition of disability. The persons whose physical, sensory or mental activities are restricted permanently due to some injury, ailment, mental, physical, or some kind of deformities developed before birth, are called the disabled persons. Thus, we find that we can divide the disability in 4 broad sections. A. Physical disability or handicap. B. Sensory disability or impairment. C. Mental disability. And D. Multiple disability. We will study each one of these disability under the section, types of disabilities, but first let us look into definition of disability. 1.2.3 Definition of disability. Now that we have got a general perception as to what the disability is, let us analyze some of its definitions. First, we would look into the meaning of the word disability as found in the dictionaries and the encyclopedia. According to Word Web Dictionary, the condition of being unable to perform as a consequence of physical or mental unfitness is called the disability. http://wordweb.info/cgibin/geoip/wordweb.x/ Another such definition endorses the same fact. Says, disability is any restriction or lack, resulting from an impairment, of ability to perform an activity in the manner or within the range considered normal for a human being. http://www.socialpolicy.ca/d.htm. The following definition also looks to be identical. Disability is a state when a person is unable to work as a result of an accident, injury or sickness. http://www.punarbhava.in. The Republic of India, being a welfare state, recognizes the specific needs of the disabled persons. There are several legal provisions which have been constituted for the well-being of the disabled persons. The definition of the disability recognized by the Indian government is as under. According to Persons with Disabilities, Equal Opportunities, Protection of Rights and Full Participation, Act, 1995. 1. Blindness. 2. Low vision. 3. Leprosy cured. 4. Hearing impairment. 5. Locomotor disability. 6. Mental retardation. 7. Mental illness. 1. Blindness refers to a condition where a person suffers from any of the following conditions, namely 1. Total absence of sight, or 2. Visual acuity not exceeding 6160 at 20120. Snellen, in the better eye with correcting lenses, or 3. Limitation f the field of vision subtending an angle of 20 degree or worse. 2. Leprosy cured person, means any person who has been cured of leprosy but is suffering from 1. Loss of sensation in hands or feet as well as loss of sensation and paresis in the eye and eye but with no manifest deformity. 2. Manifest deformity and paresis, but having sufficient mobility in their hands and feet to enable them to engage in normal economic activity. 3. Extreme physical deformity as well as advanced age which prevent him from undertaking any gainful occupation, and the expression, leprosy cured, shall be construed accordingly. 3. Hearing impairment, means loss of 60 decibels or more in the better ear in the conversational range of frequencies. 4. Locomotor disability, means disability of the bones, joints, muscles leading to substantial restriction of the movement of the limbs or any form of cerebral palsy. 5. Cerebral palsy, means a group of non-progressive conditions of a person characterized by abnormal motor control posture resulting from brain insult or injuries occurring in the prenatal, perinatal or infant period of development. 6. Mental retardation means a condition of arrested or incomplete development of mind of a person which is specially characterized by subnormality of intelligence. 7. Mental illness means any mental disorder other than mental retardation. According to National Trust for the Welfare of Persons with Autism, Cerebral palsy, mental retardation and multiple disabilities ACT, 1999. Autism means a condition of uneven skill development primarily affecting the communication and social abilities of a person, marked by repetitive and ritualistic behavior. Cerebral PDLSY means a group of non-progressive conditions of a person characterized by abnormal motor control posture resulting from brain insult or injuries occurring in the prenatal, perinatal or infant period of development. Mental retardation means a condition of arrested or incomplete development of mind of person which is specially characterized by subnormality of intelligence. Multiple disabilities means a combination of two or more disabilities as defined in Clause I of Section 2 of the Person with Disabilities, Equal Opportunities, Protection of Rights and Full Participation, Act, 1995. 1.3 TYPESOFDISABILITY. On the basis of the definition of the disability as provided in Persons with Disabilities, Equal Opportunities, Protection of Rights and Full Participation, Act, 1995, we can easily find a basis of classifying different types of disabilities. Broadly, different kinds of disabilities are classified on the basis of the organs of our body it affects. This fourfold classification is as under 1.3.1 Orthopedic disorders, deformities and injuries. The chief causes of this type of disability are the road accidents, terror tragedies, wars, diseases like polio and other orthopedic deformities. Indian government has been vigorously holding countrywide pulse polio campaigns for a decade now. Through this campaign, we have been able to virtually eradicate the disease. However, some cases of polio are reported annually from the states of Uttar Pradesh, Bihar etc. Likewise, we have been able to contain the leprosy too, which reduces the working capacity of the limbs. Nowadays, leprosy can be fully curable through the multi-drug therapy. Disputes between two or more sovereign states sometimes results in war. This is one of the chief factors of the orthopedic disability. Terror attacks also contribute to the problem. Many persons fall prey to the road accidents and several forms of violence, like the road rage, violent demonstrations, stampedes etc., and hence develop this kind of disability. By preventing the aforesaid instances, we can reduce the number of persons with orthopedic disability. 1.3.2 The disabilities relating to the sensory organs of our body. Our body has been gifted with the 5 sensory organs. These 5 senses are vision, eye, hearing, ears, taste, tongue, smell, nose, and last but not the least touch. Skin. When one or more sensory organs are not able to perceive appropriately, the state is called the disability of sensory organs. This can further be classified as 1.3.2.1 Visual impairment, partial or total. 1.3.2.2 Hearing, speech impairment. We will study the visual impairment in detail in the next unit. Therefore, it is not discussed in this unit. As for the latter one, let us always keep it in mind that the hearing is directly related to the speech. If one is not able to hear from the very beginning of her life, she would not be able to imitate the words. Hence, such person would be speech impaired too. However, if the person is speech impaired due to some other speech-related deformity, it will not affect higher ability of hearing. Therefore, as a rule, we can say that a hearing impaired person is sure to have the speech impairment. whereas, a speech-impaired person would have no effect whatsoever on his/her hearing. Speech impairment can be cured through different speech therapies conditioning that the person is able to hear. 1.3.3 Disabilities relating to our brain. Sometimes, the brain disorders and other neurological problems lead to a special kind of the disability. In such cases, the learning process gets hampered. Several behavioral problems may occur. Such disabilities are further classified as mental retardation, mental illness, cerebral palsy, autism. These disabilities are related to our brain. Most of them occur by birth itself. These disabilities are not easily detectable. As the child grows, the symptoms begin to look up. Most of the parents ignore such symptoms unless there happens to be some major abnormality. In our country, where still the rate of literacy is not very encouraging, we cannot expect much from the parents of such children. However, in the major hospitals, the facilities are available to detect such disabilities and the doctors are competent enough to provide proper prescription, counseling and rehabilitation. 1.3.4 Multiple disabilities. When a person develops two or more disabilities concurrently from the ones mentioned above, this state is called the state of multiple disability. For instance, a visually impaired may have an accident and develop a orthopedic disability too. Likewise, a hearing impaired may be victim of visionary loss. These situations are classified as multiple disabilities. 1.4 Disability, a historical perspective. In this section of the unit, we would look into the status of the disabled persons during the different phases of the history. We would also try to ascertain as to how the condition of the persons with disability changed gradually and what their present status is. 1.4.1 Pre-industrial period. Very few facts are available relating to our topic during the pre-industrial period. However, if an attempt is made to trace the history of any concern shown by the society to the visually impaired, some descriptions are available about the education of the visually impaired as early as the Mesopotamian civilization. During the period of the Mesopotamian civilization, records are available to show that letters were carved on clay to educate blind children in Mesopotamia almost 3,300 years ago. Advani, Lal and Chaddha, Anupriya, p.3. However, the pre-industrial period in general was not very conducive for the disabled. In Sparta, one of the Greek city-states, there was a convention of leaving the child outside the home after his birth, and if child survived, he was treated as brave.
This convention implies that the weaker child was supposed to be either killed or left on the nature for its survival. It is thus described that there was a time in Greek and Roman eras when children with disabilities were exposed to the elements and were permitted to die. Advani, Lal and Chaddha, Anupriya, p.3. Plato supported the killing of the physically challenged children on the basis of this convention. It was stated that the literary personality like Homer, Theresa and Phoenix opposed this killing on the ground of humanity. In its practical sense, this age was supporting the maxim of the survival of the fittest. 1.4.2 Religious faiths and the disability. Then came the emergence of Christianity, a religion which has been supporting monism. This was the period when the king was treated as the representative of the god, and this philosophy was supported by Cicero and Thomas Aquinas. To ascertain the status of the disabled in this era, one has to see the religious books and understand what is being said in it about them. The oldest scriptures, which are oft quoted, are the Vedas. In the case of Yajurveda, the treatment for the visual impairment is suggested by praying the sun, the god of brightness, and one can FMD even today, the visually impaired people uttering, Om Hansai en Amma. It was a typical personification of sun, and it was hoped if it was pleased, it would give you some share of his brightness and you will get your sight. The Christians describe the following religious story will show as to what was their viewpoint over the issue of the disabled. Quote. And they bring a blind man unto him, and besought him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand, and led him out of the town, and when he had spit on his eyes, and put his hands upon him, he asked him if he saw aught. And he looked up, and said, I see men as trees, walking. After that he put his hands again upon his eyes, and made him look up, and he was restored, and saw every man clearly. The New Testament, 8:23-25. The reference of this story has purposely been made as this is a unique story of its kind. Because in this, not only it is described that a visually impaired person is cured by Christ, but also the way he is cured needs an assessment. To cure him, it is stated that he spits on his eyes. Thereby, it is tried to explain that the spit of the Christ is so powerful that it may set the process of curing, and when Christ comes to know that the person is not fully cured, he touches him with his merciful hands. Single quote. Likewise, those who believed in rebirth, or the reincarnation, propagated that the disabilities around us were some kind of punishment for the sins committed by the disabled in the previous birth. For instance, study the following reference. Thou shalt not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before the blind, but shalt fear thy God. I am the Lord. The Old Testament, 1914. Similar attitude is found in another religious book which says, their similitude is that of a man who kindled a fire, when it lighted all around him. God took away their light and left them in utter darkness. So they could not see. Deaf, dumb and blind, they will not return to the path. Abdullah Yusuf Ali, p.2. Such directions become pertinent in a society wherein it was taught that the impairment is nothing but the punishment of some superpower due to some misdeeds. Such teachings and preaching may lead anyone to think that if it is a punishment, why one should help them and, therefore, they should be left on their own faith. But such preaching and teachings, as they used to be the commands during that period, play a conspicuous role in initiating the welfare work. The Old Testament went to the extent of saying that there should be security and shelter of the physically challenged in general, and the visually impaired in particular in the churches. Speaking over the over-protectionist and segregational approach of a Baptist church, it was stated that there is a Sunday school class for the blind, the deaf, the crippled, and the mentally retarded. They also have a separate area in church for the blind, deaf, etc. For example, the blind have a special section where they sit which is clearly marked and no one else is allowed to sit there. Does this mean that the blind will be placed in a special area before the judgment seat? Matson, Floyd, 1990. p.317. Perhaps some such suggestions became the starting point of providing the shelter to the then disabled persons, and that was the minutest symbol of the welfare work. Perhaps some such suggestions became the starting point of providing the shelter to the then disabled persons, and that was the minutest symbol of the welfare work. During the 4th century, an asylum for the blind was opened by Saint Basil in Cappadocia in 369 A.D. Sare, Ramesh. 2009. p.166. This was perhaps the first written example of the beginning of some institution for the visually impaired. Of course, this was not a part of the state policy, but it was due to the influence of the institutionalized work of the religion. 1.4.3 The disability and the state. During the medieval period, the references are found of opening asylums for the war-blinded people such as Hospice des Quinze in Paris, founded by Louis IX about 1260, cited in Report on the Blindness in India, Op. Cit. p.6. Of course, this was an attempt by a king with the help of some religious bodies to make a start with opening some space to provide shelter to the war-blinded. This commitment is not one-sided. The description is found in the Bohemian history of the 15th century when a blind patriotic military genius, named John the Turchnow, played a conspicuous role to save his country from the tyrants. Wilson, James, 1838. P.L.L.O. He was popularly known as Ziska, meaning one-eyed person, who became totally blind during the war as his other eye was hit by the arrow of the opponent army, but he continued to serve as general to save his country. During 17th century, another such example came by the name of Nicholas Sanderson, a famous mathematician, who was born in 1682 and achieved the post of a professor in Cambridge University. He became visually impaired due to the smallpox. He was a British and developed a special equipment for the visually impaired to solve the geometrical questions. An honorary degree was given to him by the then Queen of England. At that time he was just 30 years of age and he worked on this post till his death. He was made Fellow in Royal Society in 1719. He was awarded the honorary degree of Doctor of Laws by George It in 1728. He was the stimulator of the education for the visually impaired during the 18th century in Europe. He died in 1739. 1.4.4 Indian approach towards the disability. It has been a part of India's cultural heritage to help the poor and the needy even at a great personal sacrifice. The responsibility of assisting the individual in need was shared by the community and the rulers. Devotion and service towards one's fellowmen, love for charity and brotherhood existed even in the feudal times. In keeping with this tradition, every possible protection was given to the physically handicapped by the society. Money, Ramad, 1988 p3. One can find examples in the scriptures and epics of India. According to Bhagavad Gita, charity is valid only if it takes into account Dasha, place, Kala, time, and Patra, recipient. The forms of the charity were Artha, money, Yidya, education, and Abhay, courage. Religious institutions like temples, dharmashalas and mats became the centers of social service. They provided shelter and free kitchens to the poor. Thus, religion emphasized the values of charity, philanthropy and mutual help. Chowdhury, D. Paul, 1976. p.1. Commenting upon the behavior with the physically challenged in India during the contemporary period of the Greek civilization, it is stated that, in India we do not find any tangible instances of the inhuman practice of exposure and destruction, which characterized the primitive attitude towards the disabled. Mani, Rama D. Pa. A foreign writer has stated that, in ancient India the physically deformed children were cast into the Ganges. Hotwitz, H. August, 1923, p.512, refuting to this statement, it is said that, nowhere in the recorded history of India do we find any evidence to prove that this was a general practice. On the contrary, a reference to Mahabharata, an Indian epic, shows that the physically challenged were then treated with sympathy. Mani, Ramad, Op. Cit. Pa. Other references from the Indian mythology show the same picture, Ibid. Some references are made about the way tilde period and a glorious picture is depicted by uttering the names of some of the visually impaired rishis or even about Ashtavakra, whose 8 organs were said to be impaired. Mahamandleshwar Sri Swami Gangeshwar N. Anji, Vedobdesha Chandrika, pp.58-84. On the basis of the respect which he got, though his endeavors can make anyone to argue that if a physically challenged could get respect even in that age, there must be something positive in the attitude of the then people of India. Mythology and the religion apart, in India there is no specific reference of the disabled persons whereby their status can be ascertained. Of course, during the Bhakti Andolan of the medieval period, Surdas was a poet but he was a saint. The saints generally have a respectful position in the society. Thus, the example of Surdas does not qualify to prove that the disabled were in a respectable state during the period. 1.4.5 Post-industrial period. 3 factors which transfigured the history of the world during the medieval period are known to be A. Renaissance, B. Revolution and C. Reformation. Collectively this phenomenon is known as 3R factor. This initiated a new era especially in Europe. The concept of disability was also influenced with this 3R factor. People began to look at the problems of the disabled with a different angle. In the pre-industrial period, the attitude towards the disabled was that of sympathy and charity. This was guided mainly through the religious and moral, ethical considerations. Whereas, in the Post-industrial period, the disabled themselves contributed to the cause of their upliftment and development. The ferment of the French Revolution gave a special stimulus to the ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity for everyone. Great thinkers like Thoreau had a profound influence on initiating the process of special education, though not directly. During the 2 decades preceding the French Revolution, Father D. Lepe developed a manual alphabet for th-deaf. At about the same time, Germany was developing a system of lip reading. In 1784, Valentine Hau established the first school for the blind in Paris. It was known as Institute for the Blind Youth. This was time when even the representatives of the visually impaired people had started realizing that there would be a limit to remember something and there would be some other methods to keep records rather than cramming. Apart from knowing the names of the things, one of the essential parts of the education is the clarification of the concepts. For this clarification, description is needed. To avoid the repetitiveness of the description, it is necessary to keep the record of the past deeds. This necessitated developing a reading method convenient and suitable to the needs of the visually impaired. We would study the invention of Braille and other educational tools for persons with disability in other block. During the 8th century, there was a mathematician in Great Britain and a reference was also made about the development of some mathematical equipments. Reformed mathematical strip was made by Sanderson. He also developed embossed alphabets through the help of the all pins on a coach. It was a placing of the all pins and the resultant shapes which helped the visually impaired to understand the alphabets. Inspiring from this school, during the lifetime of Howe, there were about 20 schools in Europe. The activity of opening schools was not remained confined to France. A school was opened in Liverpool in England by Edward Ruston. It was just a training center providing training in handicraft and other vocational fields. As most of the students were adults, this school offered a new vista for those who became visually impaired at the later age, including the visual impairment due to the accidents. A school was also opened in Edinburgh by Thomas Blacklock with the assistance of David Miller. Valentine Howe opened a school in Russia despite the claim by the then Tsar that there were no blind in his country. Another school was opened by this personality near Berlin in 1806. The opening of such a school in Russia showed the importance of the individual efforts in this field. During the dying years of 18th century, a school for the visually impaired was opened, history of which was described as, in 1791, the first institution of the kind in England. Was established in Liverpool by Edward Ruston, who had lost his own sight during a voyage tending a cargo of Negro slaves who was stricken with malignant ophthalmia. Mahamandleshwar Sri Swami Gangeshwar Nandji, Vedopdesha Chandrika, pp.58. 84. Following this, blind asylum was established in Edinburgh. A school for the visually challenged was opened in Austria by John Wilhelm Klein in 1804. John D. Fisher got an asylum opened by getting a legislation of this effect passed due to the influence of his experiences of France. In real sense, he opened a school in 1829. In 18 feet S9, a land was donated by Colonel Perkins for this school, because of which this institute got the name of Perkins Institute, Massachusetts Asylum for the Blind, and even today it is known as Perkins School for the Blind. It is this school for the blind which grew into a research center and produced a lot of equipments for the visually challenged peoples. In 1832, another school was opened by Dr. J.D. Russ, with the name of New York Institute for the Blind. In Asia, the opening of the schools for the visually impaired started very late. In this regard, the beginning was made by Japan, with the support of the Japan government. In the decade of 1870, a school for them was opened. In Kyoto, in 1878, the visually challenged were also included in a school which was previously being run for the deaf and mute. With the support of the government, Model School for Blind and Mute was opened in 1877 in Osaka. A society had opened a school for the visually challenged in 1880 in Tokyo. In 1885, the school was brought under the government control. Now, It is known as Tokyo Government School for the Blind. In 1899, a section was opened for the deaf, and this institute is still in working condition. In India, the first school for the visually impaired was initiated by a Christian missionary. In 1887, Miss Annie Sharp, a missionary, founded the first school for the visually impaired in India. This was initially started at Amritsar, Punjab. However, due to some reasons, it was shifted to Dehradun during 1903, and from that time onwards, it was called the Sharp Memorial School for the Blind after its founder, Ms. Annie Sharp. After this initiative, many more institutes for the visually impaired came into existence. In 1889, the Canadian Presbyterian Mission established an institution for the blind at Indore. In 1890, Ms. A. K. Asquath established the Palayamkottai School for the Blind. In 1897, Mr. Bihari Shah started Calcutta School for the Blind. In 1898, Ms. O'Connor founded a class for the visually impaired at Ranchi. Major HPS. Ahluwalia, Disability Status India 2003. Another institute came into existence in the aftermath of the two world wars. In these devastating battles, many warriors injured, and hence the number of the handicapped persons increased sharply. This forced the then British government to take some action. The first ever step taken by the then British government in India was to open a training center for the war-blinded people. This institute was called Dunstan's Hostel for the war-blinded. Later on, it was opened for the civilians too. The above analysis shows that it was the general thinking of the people and the policy makers that the disabled should be educated in the special institutes. At that period of time, nobody had ever thought of the inclusive education, which has been so much in the focus for around 1 decade now. In the 19th century and most of the next century too, it was believed that the disabled were not capable of doing anything but the small tasks like teaching music, tuning piano, some kinds of therapies etc. Here, references from 2 books are presented which were the guiding peaks in the Western world in the period mentioned above. The first book was Caring for the Handicapped. It said, the blind, the deaf, the dumb, the crippled, and the insane and the feeble-minded are sometimes known collectively as the defective people who are lacking some normal faculty or power. Such people often need to be placed in some special institution in order to receive proper attention. Many blind, deaf, and crippled people can do a considerable amount of work. The blind have remarkable talent in piano tuning, weaving, wickerwork, and the like. The deaf and dumb are still less handicapped because they can engage in anything that does not require taking or giving orders by voice. McLaughlin, James, 1961, p.244. Similar passage which had been used in the high school classes of the USA. Throughout the nation, says, thus, the blind may receive aid from the states and the federal government, if their families are not able to keep them from want. There are over 100 institutions for the blind in the United States, many of which are supported wholly or partly by taxes. Sometimes it seems as if blind people are partly compensated for their misfortune by having some of their other talents developed with exceptional keenness. Blind people can play musical instruments as well as most of those who can see, and many activities where a keen touch of the fingers is needed can be done by blind people wonderfully well. Schools for the blind teach their pupils music and encourage them to take part in some of the outdoor sports that other pupils enjoy. Hughes, R.O., 1949, p.55. 1.4.6 Organizations of the Disabled and the Concept of Self-Help. For more than 50 years now, a change has been witnessed in the field of the visually impaired in the United States of America when, through the National Federation of the Blind, America, the visually challenged persons started putting their demands to the government. This movement was, in its history, was known as the self-help movement. Of course, this was an ideological stand by an organization against the agency outlook of the voluntary organizations for them. It was not a casual approach for a particular point of time or for a demand specific. Irrespective of the broader movement in the name of disability rights movement, it is still felt that the visually Impaired should have its own voice. However, a trend has been witnessed for around 3 decades to have an integrated approach in terms of including all the disabilities. For putting forth their demands, as it is learnt from the time-tested fact that when others speak for you, you lose. T. Dreyer, Diane, 1989, p.28. This idea is generated from the common say that wearer knows where the shoe pinches are. That is why the emphasis is laid on the use of the organizations which are led by the specially challenged themselves. Though derived from the liberal philosophy of laissez-faire, its tone was no less than an interest group which is supposed to be explicit and assertive to put forth his interest in the exclusive manner rather than depending upon others. It is quite understandable that it was learnt from the experience that there is no political party or any agency which can speak on behalf of the physically challenged. Hence, it is pertinent for them to come forward and put their demands in the emphatic manner. This awakening made them to speak about their oppression, a gamut of oppression, which is not just due to their physical impairment but also due to the outlook of the society and the consequent limitations posed by it. This awakening made them political, activist and humanist to change its outlook of treating itself as a mere medical entity. They have started realizing that there is a need to give a humanitarian mold to their demands and make a claim that, like others, Lie should also be treated as human beings. A raised or empowered consciousness can only bring changes. Changes cannot be brought just per chance or by waiting for the appropriate time. In the history of UE disability rights movements, DRM, it is said that the 2 years, i.e., 1973 and 1981, proved to be the milestones. It was during the early 70s that people with disabilities in the United States and Europe, influenced by and directly involved in anti-war, student, and civil rights movements, began to organize on disability-related issues. Many activists, especially in Europe, Africa, and Latin America, were also influenced by leftist politics. Throughout southern Africa, where the DRM began, on that continent, the influence of national liberation movements was important. Many of these people began to make political connections between their own lives and other social conditions and events. Commenting over such development, Rachel Hurst said, "Y. Finkelstein is a really interesting man from South Africa who had joined the Communist Party there after he sustained a spinal cord injury, and after he had been in prison for some time, he escaped and moved to England. He was one of the founders of the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation in 1975. He was one of the first people to understand our segregation because he had seen segregation so starkly in South Africa. We owe him a great debt." Cited in Charlton, James I, Op. Cit. p.131. Influenced by the social movements of his time, similar comments were made by Ed. Robert. "So much of the good that has happened to me and the good I've done have to do with being in Berkeley in the 60s. There was such energy, so much optimism. We were the generation that could and would change the world. There were all sorts of alternative living experiments and new ideas. Like everybody else, it just got caught up in them. Fortunately, there were other people with disabilities who were also affected. We were together at the right time at the right place." Ibid. As 1981 was declared as the International Year for the Disabled Persons, LYDP. Variety of activities were seen around this year. Sharing his experience, Narung Patibatsarakit said, in 1981, the International Year of Disabled Persons, Thailand, had its first workshops about disability that people with disabilities actually participated in. Cited in Charlton, James I, Op. Cit. p.132. 16. It looked that the proposal of the celebration of the IYDP yielded some positive results, and it is found that the organizations relating to the disability became active. The events in Brazil around this year were summarized by Eugene Williams thus, as a consequence, in 1980 Brazil hosted the first national meeting of entities of the disabled with nearly 1,000 participants representing the blind, deaf, physically disabled and Hansen diseased. Guidelines for action were established and also the foundation of a national coalition in an attempt to encompass the areas of disability. Moreover, a new policy was defined for the following year, the IYDP. The policy consisted of representation by disabled people and not by the specialists, IBD. It was not the case that everything which was taking place was positive for all the organizations, as it was this declaration which had suddenly charged the specially challenged in terms of realizing their identity. Consequently, in June 1980, a split took place in the Rehabilitation International over the issue of the composition of the delegate assembly by the 50% of the disability members. The resolution moved of this effect, was defeated by 61 votes against 37 votes. It was a point of annoyance for the disabled who were especially called for this occasion. It resulted in the formation of Disabled People's International, having international headquarters INW in Winnipeg, Canada. In fact, the creation of the Disabled People's International was a reaction against the Rehabilitation International, which was mainly comprised of the professionals of the field of disabilities. Expressing his experiences, Joshua Malinga said, "When I went to Singapore I was conservative, but when I returned I was very radical." Cited in Charlton, James I, Op. Cit. p.133. Similar comment was made by Danilo Delfin. "The Singapore conference had a big impact on me. I realized I wasn't so disabled, that it was possible to have a family and work. After that conference I started working on disability issues full-time." Cited in Charlton, James I, Op. Cit. p.133. If the 1996 are treated as one of the sources of stimulations, the experiences of last 13 years are the glaring example of the series of activities through which not only the Government of India was pressurized but its autonomous bodies were also forced to face public interest litigations. Some of the events during this period include organization of the World Disabled Day on TJ approximately 1 IA Gate to encourage the solidarity of the people with disability and to focus some of the issues concerning them, campaign for the inclusion of the disability in the census 2001, persuading the government to appoint a person with disability as Chief Commissioner for People with Disability. Accessibility of the disability in the general elections of the 2004 for their free access to enfranchisement etc. It may be a point of controversy that how far such issues are useful to the en masse. It all depends what type of the section within the disability one is talking about. Hence, despite the claim that there is no difference between the establishments named as of the blind and for the blind, the existence of such organizations shows that the organizations, establishments for the blind are generally governed by those who do not have the first-hand experience of the problems relating to the visually impaired. Whereas the organizations, establishments of the blind somehow have been successful in generating confidence in the hearts of the end users. Therefore, on certain issues, they still maintain their differences. On the pattern of agency-based organizations, one of the biggest organizations is known with the name of the National Association for the Blind, which was initially Mumbai-based but now has branches in many Indian states. In practice, it is a project-oriented organization. Commenting upon the nature of this organization, it is said, NAB has always opposed activism and contentious politics, believing that it is wrong to antagonize government and public, on whom we depend. Kulshaw, 1983, p.76. It is true that NAB does not participate in the direct confrontations with the government. Whenever the activities like agitations, dhammas, peace marches etc. have been taken up by different self-help NGOs in India, National Association for the Blind has kept a distance from such activities. However, the contribution of NAB for the cause of the development of facilities for the visually impaired cannot be ignored. This NGO has taken up many projects which proved to be very beneficial for the blind. Almost after 2 decades of the existence of the National Association for the Blind, an organization was developed by a handful graduates in 1971 with the name of the National Federation of the Blind. Of course, before its existence, there was a federation in existence on the tune of the Blind, with the name of the Kerala Federation of The Blind, which, with the passage of time, became th-affiliate of the National Federation of the Blind. This was an organization which was influenced by the ideology of self-help propounded by the Americans. It was this organization which had spearheaded the role of the awakening in the visually challenged. This goal kept on pressing for the legitimate demands of the visually impaired persons through all the democratic means. Due to its success, though partly, in influencing the government and get some benefits regarding the employment, reservation etc. This NGO is very popular amongst the blind. 1.5 Unit Summary. In this unit, we studied the meaning and definition of the disability. We learned that the disability is the result of the injuries inflicted upon us due to different forms of violence. Different kinds of physical deformities, brain disorders, neurological problems, sensory impairment etc. Through the historical perspective, we found that during the initial stages of different civilizations, the state of the disabled was not satisfactory. However, gradually, the society felt the necessity to look into the problems faced by the disabled. Religious faiths contributed to it comprehensively, and the Christian missionaries as well as the devotees of other faiths took up the cause of the disabled. Special tools were developed in order to impart knowledge on them. Special institutes were established so as to train them skillfully. After the two world wars, an enormous increase in the number of the disabled prompted different governments to take some action. The then British government opened first institute for the war-disabled persons, which later on was permitted for the civilians too. Educated disabled persons began to PR-SS for their legitimate demands, and a disability rights movement was initiated in the United States. Many self-help groups and associations were established world over, with a view to impress upon the appropriate governments regarding the issues related to the disability. As a result, presently, the social attitude about the disabled has transformed from that of mercy, charity and sympathy to the equal opportunities and empathy. The government has provided many facilities and concessions whereby the disabled can lead a meaningful and comfortable life. Rehabilitation, cure and prevention centers have come into existence, keeping in view the special needs of the persons with disabilities. In short, the disabled of the present era are much far better compared to those who lived 1,000 years ago, and contribute to the society in a more creative manner.